Welcome to On Crisis. I'm your host, Joanna Doven, and I have dealt with a lot of crisis shit for the past 15 years or so as press secretary for a big city mayor and in running my company, Premo Consultants. And I think we all need to know more about how to handle crisis management. In the age of fake news, political discord, lightning-fast news cycles, and social media shaming, it's essential that your business has a plan in place to handle crisis communications. We're going to have some really cool people on our show talking about behind-the-scenes stories in city government, in corporations, employee scandals. Ultimately, we're going to bring on people that will share stories with you to help you inform your own strategies. I promise we're going to have fun. Welcome to On Crisis. For our inaugural week, we're rolling out 3 different podcasts, and I'm excited to talk about Rich Lord. Rich Lord is a veteran reporter, longtime reporter with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Pulitzer prize-winning reporter. He's won over a dozen Golden Quills, most recently won a Pulitzer for his covering of the Tree of Life massacre, which occurred 3 years ago. And Rich worked with me when I was press secretary for the mayor. He was the city beat reporter at the time, so we spent about 7 years together. And we're going to dive into some things that happen behind the scenes at the mayor's office and get his understanding of where news is headed and, as such, how you should be handling your crisis today in the news media environment. I'm extremely excited about one of our inaugural guests today because Rich Lord, who is a renowned investigative reporter in the city of Pittsburgh, he now works for Public Source and does a lot of in-depth reporting into economic development and what else?
Sometimes policing lately, obviously COVID.
Lots of news on that. Rich was what I would say the top reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for a number of years. And he covered the mayor's office when I was press secretary during one of the most significant times of tumult, the death of Mayor Bob O'Connor in 2006 and the incoming inauguration of Mayor Luke Ravenstahl, who was the youngest big city mayor. And here I was, what was I, 23? Young. Younger than Luke, if you could believe it. And I had a very seasoned reporter, Rich Lord, coming at me. And there was other reporters, too. We had 11 beat reporters. Think about it. Back then, before the media decline, well, I mean, the decline had started, right? But before the media decline, and if you think about it, since May, because of Corona, over 100 newspapers have just been shut down across the nation, right? So media is changing drastically. But if you think about it, in 2006, there was a lot of reporting. There were a lot of reporters focused on what was happening with your tax dollars and with City Hall. So, having Rich on today to talk about his perspective of how the media has changed and what that means in terms of reporting on crises and reporting on big stories, I think I'm honored to have him. So, Rich, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me here. That was an amazing year.
Yes. 2006 or?
You had a mayor get sick, you had a mayor pass away, You had a very new mayor emerge and attempt to find his footing. And you're right, you had a situation in which there were, as you said, nearly a dozen reporters just dedicated to that beat consistently at that time. Very different atmosphere than you have today.
Right. And national media, too. I mean, the attention on Pittsburgh because of that situation was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, not only that situation, but the ones that emerged over the next couple of years with this city really becoming an international global city for the first time, put an enormous amount of pressure on City Hall and on the people who covered City Hall.
So tell me, what was your first, memorable interaction in 2006 with the mayor's office when Luke Ravenstahl became mayor? Does anything stick out to you?
Yeah, the first day sticks out dramatically. I remember getting the call from your predecessor, Dick Scringer, saying, the mayor has passed away. and I knew that he had to make many other calls that evening. And so I got out of his way quickly, but rushed down to City Hall in time to see the document carried across City Hall from the mayor's office to the city council chamber that conveyed the mayor's office to Luke Ravenstall. And I will never forget seeing Luke looking out through that the glass from the council side as that document was carried over, and then just the look of gravity on his face, and just the look of both seriousness and, yeah, there was a measure of trepidation there too, that I was able to see in his face. And boy, I wished at that point I was a photographer instead of a word guy, because that face told, was worth more than 1,000 words.
Right. And a lot of things, I can only imagine when, so people probably don't know this, but when Mayor O'Connor passed, he was a great guy. Anybody who knew him loved him. When he passed and Luke took oath, he would not give any media interviews until one day after the burial, out of respect for the family, which made a lot of sense. So there was a period of time, you call it the honeymoon phase, when Luke became mayor, where he was, I think people were rooting for him. And I'm sure you as a reporter were like, okay, what's this guy going to do? So, your beginning interactions with him when you were then able to see what he was, all about, interview him, deal with the administration. I'm curious, your perspective from the outside, what was, let's say, the first 6 months of the administration? I mean, was it as chaotic as maybe it was reported?
I would not characterize the early times of that administration as chaotic. You had a cautious young mayor at the time, very careful in his public pronouncements. I don't think you had any crises in the initial couple of months of the administration, really until the issue emerged of the new Penguins facility. That was really the first time that I think things got hot for that administration. Correct me if you think I'm missing something on that.
It's all a blur. It really is.
But nonetheless, and I think you're right that the city was rooting for this young
Right.
mayor. There was that give the kid a chance kind of period, and in fact that lasted for quite a while, really until I would cite the first crisis of that administration as the emergence of a new deal for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Correct me if you think that's wrong.
Well, so we had the 311 response line, right? And it's so funny because when I deal with clients now in my role as CEO of Premo Consultants, and we work a lot in crisis communications. This is why we have the podcast, because it's an interesting subject, and it's evolving as the media dissipates, which we'll talk about. But I remember, some of my bosses, they would think something was a really big deal that was happening because they got a few emails on it, and I would say, well, what's happening at 311? Let me call Wendy at 311. Let's see if it's really a crisis. And there was maybe 10 reports. When the Penguin situation was going on, 311 was blowing up. Thousands and thousands of emails and calls per day. It was definitely a crisis.
That's a great strategy, by the way, looking for some logical metric that you can rely on to gauge the level of a crisis, because I think far too often right now, 5 tweets makes a crisis to some administrations, and it's fantastic to be able to turn to something that's more objective.
Yeah, no, that's, hey, I tried to be rational as best as I could, right? So the other, interesting point, well, hey, the Penguin situation got solved, and I think we know the benefit of hindsight of what was really happening behind the scenes, right? Playing the card, what kind of subsidy can you get, getting the best deal, and they ultimately prevailed. But it's funny, now we still have a site in the Hill District that is still sitting, not developed. Are you reporting on that at all right now?
Yeah, we've been reporting pretty intensively on the twists and turns there. And obviously that's kind of a slow boiling crisis, in that you have a development that should, by all logical thinking, be well on its way by now. There's been a community benefits agreement in place, which was its own little crisis for 6 years. And yet, because continues to be mistrust between a neighborhood and a developer, and then a city kind of in the middle of that. You just can't. It just hasn't moved beyond. I don't know, the blue line. Is that the right hockey metaphor?
I mean, is there an absentee in city leadership that's not pushing it forward? Because I'm asking this, and this is not to point fingers at anyone, but in working with communities when I worked for the mayor's office, and then clients I've had where I've had to deal with communities, there's never going to be an agreement on all sides of the aisle ever, and sometimes it takes somebody just to push a little bit. But these days, it's like you can't push.
Different administrations take different philosophies as how to balance that. When I started working this job, Mayor Tom Murphy was in office, and under that administration, there was a very strong tilt towards getting something built, no matter what, just get something started. And then I won't characterize really the Ravensall administration, but now there's the foot is more on the brake pedal right now. Is there community concern? Does that community concern appear to be persistent and grounded? If so, we're going to step on the brake. We're not going to step on the gas on development. So it's really just a different way, I think, of balancing that community versus development scale.
Yeah, some like the approach and some don't. You can guess who likes it. You can guess who doesn't like it, right? I think we could. So let's sort of dial it back, and I want your perspective, which I expect to be pretty stark, on the media landscape, comparing it to 2006, right, to now 2020. Let's just close our eyes here and let's pretend that there's a significant crisis. I mean, there's a crisis right now. I mean, we're okay.
2, 3, 4.
Actually, there's many. There's enough. So what, when you talk about from a resource standpoint, from having, and reporters in the media, they're the fourth tenet of democracy. If we don't have good reporting, how do we know what's happening and how can we make informed decisions? Reality is there's less reporters today, okay? There's less publications today. And there also seems to be a changing of philosophy in some news organizations. What I'm seeing in my business is there's less grit and less desire to go after hard investigative stories from many of the traditional outlets. But I want to hear your thoughts and maybe ultimately what made you leave the Post-Gazette?
I'll get there.
Okay.
But you kind of set the table early on. When you took that job in 2006, there were nearly a dozen reporters who knew that terrain. Mm-hmm. You won't find that right now. The number of reporters who are able to really dedicate substantial time to a given beat like City Hall, I'd have several fingers left over on one hand if I wanted to count them. And news will always flow to a crisis regardless of the staffing. So if there was a crisis in City Hall right now, you'd still have a dozen reporters reporting on it. It's just that only 2 or 3 of them would know what they were talking about. The rest of them would be flying by the seat of their pants, taking whatever morsel was thrown out there that day, and you just would not get the kind of depth, I think, of coverage that you would have gotten, 14 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I mean, are we just? Is the result is that we're all going to get a little dumber as a society? I mean.
Well, the flip side, of course, is that you're able to more easily find a whole variety of perspectives than you were able to in 2006. Mm-hmm. Just by virtue of social media, it's just you'll have to sort through the junk and find the good stuff, which is a sometimes labor-intensive process. 2006, there was kind of one set of facts from which everyone was debating, and it kind of came through the daily newspapers and a couple of the mm-hmm. TV stations. Now it seems like when America debates something, or when Pittsburgh debates something, they're not debating based on the same set of facts. They're debating based on 2 or 3 different collections of facts that don't seem to overlap like they used to.
That's a really insightful way to put it. Really insightful. Yeah, I mean, we worked on a crisis recently involving university, and without giving the client away, it had to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and an individual that, quite frankly, was seizing on that movement for financial gain and putting out information via social media that was not factual, and her ability to galvanize a base of supporters was very good, and it happened really quickly. And the university's ability to put out factual information and get it covered, that didn't really happen. And part of that was, there were some legal things happening behind the scenes, and when lawyers get involved, they say, don't talk to the media, don't do this, and then guess what? You lose the public perception game, and then you ultimately could, lose, lots of money, right, if your reputation's damaged. But what I saw in trying to intervene, I was trying to get the facts about, it's so hard not talking about it. I was trying to get the facts out there, right? And I went to the traditional papers to do that. I know these people. I still know editors that actually still work at the Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, and nobody wanted to touch it. Have you had any situations where you've maybe had a story that you were reporting facts and it struck ire on one side of the aisle and you were having to defend yourself as a reporter?
Oh, sure. These days, almost anything strikes ire on one side of the aisle or the other. And since George Floyd, policing has been one of those major flashpoints, of course. You really can't, you really have to be very, very scrupulous in reporting on anything related to policing in a way that if you don't want to take flack from one side or the other or both, even a photo these days can upset people. I covered a march early in the post-George Floyd era, and just tweeted out a picture which happened to include a couple of police officers kneeling with a large body of demonstrators. And I was immediately taking heat from the left side of the spectrum. How could you post that? That's cop propaganda. That's out of context. And I gotta give credit to the police union officialdom in this area. They have thick skin. They typically recognize balanced reporting when they see it, and only if you get the facts wrong do you take it from the police union side. But you will get criticism from police rank and file and from law enforcement supporters if you appear to be taking kind of a pro or a stance that provides some sympathy to the kind of Black Lives Matter side of the equation.
I think there's a feeling from people on one side or the other, but I'll just say if I'm a police officer, right, and there's a protest about if I'm an insider, I know the facts of why this Black individual was arrested, right? Maybe this person charged an officer, maybe and I know the facts, and so let's say there's a protest about this. Immediately I'm like, why are you covering this protest, reporter? Didn't you talk to us and know that this was an arrest that took place following all of the standard operating procedures, and this officer's life, he felt like it was on the line, and that's why this person was arrested or tased or something. Why are you covering it? I think people who don't understand journalism, they already get mad if you're covering something they think isn't newsworthy. But just like this incident was being covered at this university, and one day I'll be able to talk about this more openly, the news media fed the cycle, and they kept feeding and feeding the cycle. And it was a national issue, the Black Lives Matter movement, that's getting tons of national attention, and the news media was able to localize that story, so they kept giving it attention. Even when, and I will say, even when we got facts out there to editors and to news directors, some of them stopped, and some of them became more balanced in their coverage. But it still felt very skewed to me. It felt like more skewed than maybe it would have been in 2006.
Well, you raise a really interesting issue that now reporters have to deal with in a way that they did not before, which is what do you do when you encounter a falsehood that has nonetheless ignited and taken fire.
Because you get used.
But what do you do? Do you report it and then report the denial? Do you try to ignore it? If you do report something that you believe to be false, but that has nonetheless emerged as a major piece of a major moving piece of news on social media, are you just giving it air? If you spend time debunking something that's a falsehood that has nonetheless caught fire, are you taking time away that you should actually be spending finding actual information? There's a lot of things you have to weigh as a reporter right now when you're dealing with falsehoods that catch fire.
So who makes those decisions, though? I mean, I guess every newsroom is different, but let's, that's the thing. I mean, and then we're all individuals, we're all humans, so we have inherent bias.
We do, and you look at say QAnon right now. QAnon's it is a crisis for democracy. The fact that millions of people appear to be very interested in something that does not appear to have a basis in fact.
Right.
But what does the media do about it? You have to make decisions based on your allocation of resources. NPR, for instance, appears to be comfortable spending a lot of time debunking and addressing falsehoods and the effects of falsehoods on our democracy. But if you're a small or mid-sized local outlet, can you afford to take resources away from covering nuts and bolts news that people need in order to deal with the constant stream of falsehoods that's unfortunately polluting our society?
Wow, that's deep, and it's so true, and hey, yesterday, Google's CEO, Facebook's CEO, Twitter's CEO, they were all speaking in front of Congress about this very topic, right? Because social media is perpetuating all of this. If anyone has not listened to this who hasn't seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, have you seen it yet, Rich?
Mom tells me I got to watch it. Haven't done it yet.
I mean, because I work in media, right? I do. I've worked in media for, I don't know, 2000, too long. I can kind of smell, I can read something and I can tell if it's biased, or I can, I'm very choosy with my news. I mean, I can tell you my news routine, you'd be like, it's not that bad, right? So even with documentaries, even more, like you have to watch those, right? But when I looked into Social Dilemma and I saw who was being interviewed on it, these are former major execs with Facebook and Twitter and algorithm scientists talking about how the entire goal is to keep somebody on the platform for as long as possible so that we can sell their data for more money. The way you do that is you give them things that feed their biases, right? And so if I believe in the QAnon crazy conspiracy and I click on one thing, it's going to keep giving me more and more and more until I stop doing it. Then it'll give me something else. But, it's dangerous. It's a dangerous game. So watch that, everyone. And then, think about, so let me ask you this. What is your news routine? I think this is a great question because news has changed too. Like some outlets that were really good aren't as good.
I gotta say, and so much more is now under paywall than was, say, 14 years ago, since that's our starting point. But I still start with the local dailies. I still then check the Times and the Post for the national news.
So you do
the Post Gazette, the Tribune Review, the Times, the Post, WESA online. I usually have WESA on in the background too. Look at, say, the Guardian for some lefty news. Frankly, if there's something like a debate that I want to get a really different perspective on, I'll check the right side of the spectrum too. I'll look at Breitbart.
What's your writing news?
I'm sorry?
What writing news would you go to?
Writing news?
Like
writing
right
news.
of the spectrum.
I love to look at, say, Breitbart.com just to see what is happening there. The Fox website. So I try to get a mixture of kind of the mainstream, and I try to see what's happening on sort of the conservative side of the spectrum also.
Do any national publications strike you as more moderate than others? Like
It's really hard to find anything
Journal?
nowadays.
The Journal?
Not so much anymore. It's hard for me to find something domestic that most people would agree is centrist news right now. I'll look overseas. I'll look at the British papers if I want to see reaction to, say, a presidential debate that I don't think would be accused of being on one side or the other.
Did you watch the debates?
Sure. Yeah.
Did you? Oh man, I'll tell you the last debate. The first debate, I have to confess, I had a few glasses of wine before it, right? And I had a tough day that day. I had a lot going on. And I went to a small social gathering, right? Here's how I got through coronavirus. How I'm getting through it is I decided early on, here's like my 5 good friends, and we're just going to hang out. And that's just the way it is. We're all going to be safe, and we're going to hang out. And that's really saved my mental health. But I had a few glasses of wine, and there are some people who had such a visceral reaction to Trump's behavior at that debate, and they were angry. I laughed at that entire debate. It was a comedy session to me. And I think that's because I worked in politics, and I remember one of the first debates that Bob O'Connor had at, I guess it would have been at the old Kelly Strayhorn Theater. Were you there? Remember
Quite
that?
possibly. I covered a lot of those.
That one reverend that was running, he was from Homewood. What was his name? There was, and Les
Ludwig.
Les Ludwig was there.
Yeah.
I mean, we had, and look, this is not the nation's, fate. This is the city of Pittsburgh, but, it's mayor's debate. And that debate, it was so funny. So, but the last debate, it to me was everyone just was so scripted, and, the mute button made it less interesting for me, so I turned it off.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could deal with the second debate a lot better than I could the first. Maybe because I have foreign in-laws, and I'm often thinking, how is this possibly going to be viewed overseas? That's part of
you do?
Yeah.
So wait, where are they from?
They're from the Netherlands.
Oh, neat. I don't think I knew that.
They get a different perspective, and so I'm often checking the international news just to try to get an outsider's view on the nuttiness that is our country right now.
And what would you say the outsider's perspective is on our country? Worse, or is it worse than we think, or is it better than we think?
Well, I think it's as bad as you would imagine.
Yeah.
It's for instance, after that first debate, which you were able to laugh off, some of us
don't hate me, audience.
Some of us probably had a tougher time with that. But the perspective was worst debate in American history, and I don't know that I can argue against that. And the immediate go-to talking points were the commentary about the far right. And some of the kind of racially tinged and divisive statements that were made in between the interruptions.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there were some bad interruptions there. It's just, I think for me, I can't stand, and I'm not telling you who I voted for. I've already voted, but everybody will be able to guess. I'm sure people who know me know who I voted. But I can't stand PC, like the political correctness from politicians on either side of the aisle. I just want I want honesty and authenticity. And Trump has given that, but he's taken it to a level that's it's crazy. It's crazy. So I just wish there was a politician that would have the nature of like speaking up for yourself and just not saying not being crass and rude and a jerk, but not being so PC either. Like, where's that happy balance in a politician?
Well, I want to address something that raises and a crisis that you'll remember very well, Snowmageddon, when we were hit with 2 feet of snow back in 2010, I guess it was, just a mere decade ago. At that time, it was assumed by reporters, including me, that anything that was said in officialdom, that anything a mayor said, for instance, was, on its face assumed to be accurate. So if the mayor said, we're getting the streets cleared, I was perfectly comfortable saying, Luke Ravenstahl said, we're getting the streets cleared. Then I get attacked from readers whose streets weren't cleared, who would say, why are you parroting what the mayor says? But that was still an era in which if it came from the top executive of the city or the county or the state or the nation, it was presumed to be accurate. And that perception has changed, and that's made reporting much more difficult.
Oh, yeah. You don't know if you're being manipulated, or I think you just assume you are when you're getting that information. Snowmageddon, that was the most difficult crisis I've dealt with, I think, at all. Because, when I hearken back to that time, there's so many stories to tell. But the mayor wasn't there. He was in Seven Springs, and everybody was blaming him for being away, but everyone also woke up very surprised that morning that we got 22 inches of snow. So the forecast was off, right? Everybody was surprised. And when you have a snowstorm, it doesn't just blanket one neighborhood, it blankets the entire city. So the entire city, and really region, and many actual states were under an emergency. What I don't like is when politicians try to take advantage of crises for their own political benefit. And that happened a lot in that snowstorm. And that was frustrating. We saw council people like Patrick Dowd and Teresa Kell Smith going into the 311 lines, helping the 311 staff working. Then we saw councilors like Bill Peduto and Natalia Rudiak firing off press releases, slamming public works people who were literally working 18-hour shifts. This is the last thing they needed. We needed to come together as a city. So, I saw, the taste in my mouth I had for certain people on council just was not good. And it remains that way today because people's lives were in danger. And the mayor got back. I was in that EOC locked in for like a week straight. And when the mayor got back as soon as he possibly could, like safely, he was locked in too. We were all in the EOC with all the public safety officials, with the county, and I saw how hard everyone worked, including the mayor. And we did our best. If you think about it, we had to get we had to call in the National Guard because there were seniors who couldn't get to their dialysis appointments and needed their medication, and we couldn't get the roads clean.
Do you recall, though, whether you were given kind of any grace period before the criticism started pouring in?
It was 24 hours.
The
first
that's 23 more than you would get right now, to be honest. The situation has gotten that much worse.
Well, in the city?
Yeah, not necessarily in city politics.
Oh,
although,
I know.
yeah, I think...
Really?
Maybe not in city politics because there's a different kind of dynamic right now than there was then.
And there's, look, I had you and Jeremy Boren, right? Jeremy Boren, Tribune Review. You guys were both, you're a Sagittarius, you're a go-getter, like you're getting the news, you're out there, you're fire sign, and I'm going to find out his sign too. But you guys were on it, and you were aggressive, and if I was a naysayer and didn't like the administration and I wanted to give you a tip, you would pursue that tip, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case now. I don't know if there's reporters at the Trib and the Post-Gazette, and not to mention there's no more TV beat reporters in City Hall anymore. That's not happening. That would pursue tips. So naturally, the news against somebody in charge is going to quell, right? It's going to quell.
And anytime you get kind of a news monopoly, as you have in many markets, it does change the dynamic. The dynamic that existed when you were in City Hall was if someone had a piece of hot news and either Jeremy or I wouldn't take it, they'd go to the other one. And Jeremy and I both knew that. So if I was going to pass on a piece of news, I knew that it would probably find an outlet somewhere else. But that's different nowadays. You don't have the same level of competition. So a deeper, harder story might just not emerge. So
when you look back at your time as beat reporter, do you have any regrets? You were great. I'm just wondering, like the benefit of hindsight and looking at how you approach things, or, do you have any perspectives that have changed, just sort of maybe even about Luke or?
Well, I think as you continue in media, you're more willing to take a chance on skipping a story in order to get to a better story. reporting, I think, is a lot like playing baseball. You know, you go to the plate and you try to find a good pitch that you can hit reasonably far. A good story, you know, maybe you may be able to stretch it out to a double. Who knows? Sometimes you see a pitch that you can hit for a home run, a really impactful story that'll make a difference for readers and people. But I think as you continue in this job, and it's probably the same in crisis management, you realize that you've got to wait for your pitch. You know, you've got to wait for something that really has news value, that really can have impact, and don't swing at something that is iffy, or that is, I guess, to keep the baseball metaphor going, on the edge of the strike zone.
Love it. That's great. That's great. You're full of good metaphors and stories.
You're bringing it out, Joanna. You really are.
My gosh. So when you worked for the Post-Gazette, I mean, it's kind of different because you weren't like a business writer where you were getting pitched to by random PR people all the time. But like how, on a given day, like how many pitches were you getting from people wanting you to write something?
A good 4 a day would be typical in City Hall on a you know, maybe a little fewer on a Friday.
Yeah.
But yeah, you'd often have a number of
city employees, and you're getting city employees, you're getting council people, council staff. You know.
And once you learn what you're doing, you're getting obviously information from the mayor's office, council, controller, unions, neighborhood groups. Once you kind of learn to work the periphery, and the periphery learns how to work you, you know, it's a pretty steady stream of story ideas, of quote news.
So why did you like it? Did you like it? I'm assuming you did. You were good at it. You did it for a long time.
Yeah, I did, because it was an adrenaline rush. The time always went fast. You know, City Hall is a place that feels like a kind of bad Thanksgiving dinner almost every day, you know, just because it has a family atmosphere, but
That's
not
so
a boring
true.
family at all.
Oh my gosh, that's another good one. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
So it was an enjoyable time. If I had to look back and find regrets, I'd probably regret picking up the phone at 6 o'clock in the evening a lot of the time, because it's a beat that doesn't stop.
Right. Hey, I always answered your call.
You did.
Can we get some praise? I need some praise.
You did. You were always trying to get me to the right place. Absolutely.
I was, you know, because if you become the person that is in charge of the information, and if you give the information out, then you can also at least help to shape things in the story, which when we deal with crisis communications clients now, my number one thing to say to clients is you need to be informative, right? And if you try to hold back information and not be aggressive with it, then you're gonna be chasing all of the news stories and not controlling them. Is that
you
accurate?
got something very early on that a lot of people just never get, which is exactly what you said. You know, if you're not going to participate in the story, then someone else is going to shape the narrative. Even if it's a bad story for you, I, as a reporter, always think that the institution would, or the politician would gain from participating in the story, just because then they're participating in the narrative. Then their perspective is going to be reflected, which is always better than a no comment or couldn't be reached.
Never say no comment. Rule number one. You know what Dick Scringer taught me? One of the best things he taught me. And Dick, if you're listening, you're the best. My old boss, he was a great guy. And how would you describe Dick? He was different. He was, how would you describe Dick?
Just extremely seasoned and kind of wise in the ways of the press and government. Absolutely.
Yes, very, very wise. But he taught me early on, he said, if you don't know the answer to something, or if you don't want to give the answer, just say, hey, let me get back to you on that, right? Just let me get back to you on that in a really nice way. And then guess what? Maybe you'll get back to the reporter. Maybe they'll forget, or maybe you get back to them and you give them a nice email saying, here's why I can't tell you this. It's a personnel issue, or I don't have the information right now. I'm working on getting it. But it's so much easier than a no comment. And it's kind of like, no comment's just rude. Like, no comment. It's not even a sentence. Like, it's not even, I don't know. I actually had a CEO client from a national organization, like so a big client, recently tell a reporter no comment. And in this case, it was fine. It didn't work against him, but I just had assumed that this CEO he definitely has had media training. He's been in a lot of news. But I was like, wow, I haven't heard that one in a while.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe media fragmentation makes that a little bit easier for that CEO because he's speaking to one outlet. Maybe that outlet does or does not have some legs, but maybe they feel like, okay, this outlet isn't going to affect public opinion that much. I can say no comment and get away with it. But I don't think that's an accurate understanding of the way media works, because that no comment can be the top of a tweet that goes viral nowadays. It's not, I think, a wise position to take. If you have a narrative, if you have something informative and thoughtful to say, you ought to say it.
Yeah. So let's, we're nearing the end of our session here, and I have to talk about this even though I don't want to, but the tail end of the mayor's administration. So he started in crisis, right? Major crisis, and I have to say, the hand that was dealt to the administration in which I worked. We had the G20 Economic Summit, which I believe we handled fabulously on all fronts when you compare it to, other G8s. I mean, I'm telling you, I still get calls from people that are having summits in other cities asking questions, picking our brain on how we did things. Always room for improvement, but we handled it. And then you had, of course, this snow-mageddon literal shitstorm. Am I allowed to say shit? Oh my God, it was so bad. And then you had the officer, April 4th officer tragedy. And you had Washington Boulevard, that horrible tragedy.
Right.
And there was the tornado in 27 in Mount Washington. And I'm sure I'm missing some, but then we have an FBI investigation that gets thrown on our lap. So the mayor ended in crisis. His whole administration was in crisis. And of course, I was the press secretary, which is why, surprise, surprise, I work in crisis communications. It's like all I know. But I actually resigned before he left, so I was pregnant with my second son. I mean, do you remember me walking around pregnant like all the time?
Oh yeah.
Right? I'm getting harassed by the media. I'm 9.5 months pregnant. Everyone's fighting in the office. I literally walked in and I was like, I quit. I was like, this is not good for me. But there's no greater crisis than a federal investigation, because we saw it play out nationally. How it can shake a public to its core, because now you're questioning not just someone's morals and values, but did they in fact break the law, right? What do you remember about that time reporting?
Well, the genesis of that, of course, was concerns about the police chief at the time, Nate Harper, and we learned in, I believe it was early 2013, that he was, that's when it became publicly known that he was the subject of an investigation for corruption, and that's an irresistible story for the media, obviously. A police chief accused of, and in fact eventually pleading guilty to corruption.
The fact that he was black, too. I mean, I hate to say it, but insider's perspective, I don't know who knows this, but that investigation did not start with Nate Harper.
We reported 9 months before the investigation that it started with a gentleman named Art Bedway, who eventually did also plead guilty to unrelated crimes. But it didn't start with the police chief, but it got there, and that's going to be the ultimate feeding frenzy. You're going to go from having 11 reporters covering you to having 22 reporters covering you in a snap of a finger.
Yeah.
And then to see that investigation then expand into apparently federal interest in what the mayor was doing in his spare time, and the involvement of public resources potentially or allegedly in that, that's a very difficult situation for both a responsible reporter and a responsible administration to be in.
Remember that story about the Steelers? What was it? One of the Steelers trophies.
Sure. Yeah.
Did you report that?
Probably.
So I'm just going to tell you what happened, audience, and I don't care. I'm too old to be PC. Basically, Bill Peduto and others on council spent their entire time on council trying to be mayor, right? And they threw as many grenades as they could at the mayor's office. And not that I don't have respect for the mayor now, and I think he has a lot of good policies now, but I just know what I went through during that time. And one of those stories that I hear from very good account was that the mayor stole some Super Bowl trophy, and that was perpetuated by somebody wanting to be mayor, i.e. Bill Peduto, and reporters reported on it, and guess what? It wasn't stolen. It was given to him. It was lent to him. They wanted it to be in his office to show it off, right? And I don't remember how it all went down, but certainly he was going to give it back and not steal it. It became a huge news story, with the headline, first mayor is under a federal investigation. Now he's stealing his Steelers trophy. And it's like, it's I don't know. When politicians get on this high moral high ground and just try to take people down, I just gotta. Things come back full circle, and I think that Bill Peduto has been seeing that recently with some of the protests he's had at his house, where you sometimes as a mayor you can't always win, right? And I think he's being humbled pretty quickly. So I wanted to give my 2 cents there.
Just a quick fact correction: you're definitely not old.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm starting to feel it. I'm approaching 40.
But you remember that period of that investigation. That was a grand jury probe, and you had the federal prosecutors subpoenaing members of the administration to come in and talk to the grand jury. That grand jury room was accessible from a public hallway in which I and 10 other reporters would sit every time we knew that grand jury was meeting. And we can report on somebody walking in and then walking out and then not having a comment, and that's a difficult spot for you to be in because you don't know what's going on in that room.
It's crazy.
Nor do we, but we do have to report when a high official is brought in front of a grand jury.
You know, it all comes down to money when you think about it. I mean, when I look back at that time, and I'd have to reread things and just sort of look back at my journals, but there was a man named Freddie Crawford who was one of the mayor's former bodyguards, and he was to me he was one of the nicest guys. However, he was a major philanderer. I mean, like, and I'll just say it on air. I mean, he had a lot of women who he was obligated to give money to for certain reasons. You can imagine why, okay? And his lack of handling the mayor's security was called into question, and his overtime was brought down severely. And then guess what happened, right? Then he's spilling any secret he can, right, about here's what the mayor was doing at his house. Here's what, and when you look at the people who tried to perpetuate this investigation into the mayor, and you look at the lack of moral high ground that they had, it's just unbelievable. But nonetheless, so the mayor resigns, and there's no indictment on the mayor. There was nothing. And when the FBI looks, when they spend time, and I know this because I have a good friend in the FBI, but when they spend time looking into something, they do it because they want to find something. Like, they're not going to put resources into something if they're not going to go all in. And if you're going all in, you want to find something. There was nothing that they found that could put the mayor in a position like Nate Harper. So I digress off of my soapbox. One day he'll tell his story, maybe on this podcast. What do you think, Rich?
I hope so.
Get him on. Hey, he was in Pittsburgh Magazine not long ago.
I did not realize that.
Yeah, it was just sort of like a where are they now, and it was like 3 graphs of what he did. It was very short. So let's end this by, I want to hear your predictions. 2006, we had a pretty full slate of media covering important topics: good news, bad news, crises, beat reporters who understood City Hall, who knew how government, who knew the city's budget, right? Who could say, I remember it was like when things started to go awry, like 2011, there was a lot more cuts in TV, and there were no more TV beat reporters. So I remember releasing the budget address, and I sat down with I spent more time educating reporters on like the city and the city budget than I did putting out news and press releases. I digress. So now here we are. We have newspapers all over the country just completely decimated. No TV beat reporters anymore. There's a big role for journals like Public Source now. And can you talk about why? And how tell us so Public Source, for those who don't know, you came on the scene 10 years ago?
Close.
Yeah.
Yep.
10 years ago.
Yep.
And it was funded by the endowments?
It's been foundation funded from the beginning, although now we have a pretty significant base of individual donors too.
But the impetus in 2010 was to do more longer form reporting on critical issues that impacted the region, like mostly the environmental issues.
Well, the motto is Stories for a Better Pittsburgh, and I think across a number of different news areas, development, environment, health, public safety, that's education, that's what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. So why is there more of a place for a Public Source today than there was 10 years ago?
Because of the cuts, especially at the dailies, but also at the electronic media, TV especially, that have really reduced the ability of those outlets to do the deeper stories. You still have a lot of talent at the Post-Gazette and the Tribune Review, and you still have a lot of folks who are extremely capable at turning out an incisive story, daily story, or two or three sometimes on a given day. But when you've got so many crises going on at once, COVID, civil rights, an election that's in doubt, it's a mad scramble. It doesn't allow the reporters to spend the time, take a couple of days out off of the gerbil wheel, and just go deep on a story like we used to be able to do at the dailies. So that's why there's I think a growing space for publications like Public Source, where we're not obligating ourselves to cover everything that happens at the mayor's office. You can pick your spots. If I need to take a week to get a story right, I take a week to get a story right.
How do you stay objective knowing that there's special interests funding, I guess most news organizations, but Public Source, I know the Heinz Endowments is really big on, the Breathe Project, which I think they've called something else now. Is there a certain push to cover certain things?
I haven't seen that, and just full disclosure, my job is, my beat is funded by the Heinz Endowments. I'm fully aware of that. It's at the bottom of every one of my stories. But last week there was a hearing in relation to the proposal to build a connector from Hazelwood to Oakland, the Mon-Oakland Mobility Project. And I covered that because it was an issue of concern to many residents of the city, especially in the sort of the run area of Greenfield. And so I had to kind of put my knowledge that, frankly, the Heinz Endowments funds my job off to one side. I had to put my knowledge that the Heinz Endowments is also co-owner of the entity that owns Hazelwood Green out of my head and just plain cover what happened. And fortunately, I think I've been in this business long enough that I can do that. I can set aside any concerns other than the news of the day.
Right, and you're a smart guy. You know what's going to what could be triggering to some certain people, and you can balance everything out. So, okay, so you're covering issues of development, police. Let's talk about development. What is exciting you right now in the city of Pittsburgh when it comes to development? You've been, since you've covered city politics, development is right in there. So you've been doing this for a long time, and people don't realize just how hard you work. You work hard. You're diving in. If I want to read something, related to development, or where you're like, and I want to know what's really happening, I'm going to read your story over anybody else's. So what right now is happening that you think is maybe too under the radar? Or?
Well, it's kind of
what's
that whole
exciting you?
rebalancing of the scales thing we were talking about.
Okay.
I mean, the crises when I started covering URA meetings back in 1996 or 97 revolved around the general collapse of the Pittsburgh economy and the reverberations of the loss of steel, the huge amount of vacant land, the closure of retailers throughout the city. And now the crises, until COVID, were very different. You know, it was a kind of a booming market in many sectors, an affordable housing crisis, gentrification in many neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that were trying to push back against development. So it's just been interesting that it's almost a totally flipped narrative. And then, of course, everything was thrown into, you know, what do? You flip the table and the cards fly in the air or whatever, the pieces fly in the air. In March when COVID came, we don't know what will emerge.
I'm hearing that there's some New York investors looking at Pittsburgh because, you know, there's a belief that we really haven't, compare us to a big city, we're doing great, right? Our real estate market, we're doing awesome. And the question is that stability going to equate to growth post-COVID?
You wonder too when the New York investors start looking, if they're looking for you know, cheap buys, cheap pickups,
wholesalers, yeah.
and if we see an eviction surge, and if we see a foreclosure surge, will we again have a market that bottoms out like it did in 2008 and becomes cheap for outside investors to buy in?
Well, on that note, all right, let's end on something.
Yeah, that's
positive.
a dour note. We can't stop there.
Let's end on something positive. So, all right, this probably isn't positive, but this is the last question I wanted to ask you. So there's an emergence in these sort of journals that are funded by outside sources with the goal of filling the news gap that exists now, right? Huge news gap for good reporting, for longer form journalism. Where do you see the media headed in the next 5 years? What changes do you see? I mean, let's look at the Post-Gazette. What are you hearing there?
They're obviously still very deep into a labor crisis. They have an imposed contract which the union opposes. The union has voted to authorize a strike. As far as I know, they're waiting on authorization from higher ups in the Communication Workers of America union before they would conceivably walk. So that's been the foundation of the information flow in this town for a long time. The Post-Gazette just playing the most reporters, the most news, and a lot of other outlets depended on the Post-Gazette to frankly tell them what was going on.
Right. That's the people are missing that. Like if we don't have a foundational traditional outlet that has history and has institutional knowledge, if we don't have a stable institutional media outlet in our city, then it's going to impact all the other outlets.
I got to say, though, outlets like, I believe, Public Source, WESA, some of the other online-only outlets, too, are trying to expand to fill the niche. I think you'll see a lot more attention to city government. Look at the city budget that's going to emerge in the coming weeks. I think and hope that you'll see attention from outlets that might not have been there 14 years ago that are going to try to bring a deeper perspective to covering the budget and covering how it affects people on the ground, too.
Love it. Opportunity to innovate for the outlets that have been smaller or more niche to sort of expand their audience.
I think so, yeah.
And really, I mean, I think where I see the opportunity is being smart with digital, right? You know, knowing how to use social media. Play it to your advantage. I mean, that's everyone's, social media is ruining news, it's fake news. Well, the media needs to get better at playing it to their advantage. I mean, they need to be running ads and getting their content out there. They need to be doing that. I almost think we could start a consultancy just on advising news organizations how to push their news in front of audiences. It's not buying big billboards. You know, it's getting on the mobile phones.
It's true. I believe 70% of our traffic is mobile right now at Public Source. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys do a pretty good job. But, you know, I remember talking with, I'm not going to say the person's name, I don't want to, a reporter recently with the Post-Gazette who was saying that they have to, what was it? They're being told they have to, you know, write social copy and share their story, and they're being pushed to do social media. but they've had no training. They've had like no training on how to do it. And that's a 4-hour training you can bring someone to do. Come on. Anyways, radio, terrestrial radio, KDK radio. What's that? I mean, Wendy Bell leaving again. I mean, she helped build the younger audience, the female audience. Now she's gone. We've got a lot of tumult at KDK radio. Is Marty going to stay?
You remember when you had numerous radio outlets just covering straight news.
Mm-hmm.
You really don't have that now. And so I don't know that space as well as I used to, other than WESA, obviously. WESA is very dedicated to covering the news. But I think if you're a discriminating consumer of news, this coming age could be a golden age, because you're going to be able to find the deeper news. You're going to be able to find a variety of perspectives and a variety of takes on, hopefully, a shared set of facts. But you're going to have to look a little harder. It's not going to show up in your driveway every day.
Yeah, it's going to show up on your news feed, right? Hopefully, if we can figure out, we can do good social media with public source. Get you guys. I want to see you every morning. Well, Rich, hey, thank you for your time. This has been. I could talk to you for another hour, but I know you probably have to get home to your kids, and I have to get home to my kids, and do some work with Doven here. I want to thank the Pittsburgh Technology Council for having us in their studio. We're going to be using their studio for this podcast. It's just nice. We could be doing this via Zoom, but in the days of just being so separate from actual eye contact, I think if we're going to have a meaningful podcast, doing it in person as much as we can is important. So I appreciate you coming out to do this, and I'll let you know when it airs, and we'll love to have you back on. We'll look at when you do another big story and it's really interesting from a crisis standpoint. We'll have you back on to talk about it and expand on it.
Great to hang with you
Sound
again,
good?
and I'd love to come back. Thanks,
Love
Joanna.
it. Okay, thanks, Rich.